So, from listening to a few things that people had presented and so forth, with the Ruby meetups, we've been primarily focused, of course, on Rails, which is wonderful because a lot of the stuff that people are doing involves Rails. But I've been using Ruby for quite a long time, and some of my first uses of it were not with Rails. And to this day, I continue to keep going on that. And what I wanted to bring forward was maybe to show people some ways of doing some things and approaching some stuff and using Ruby for other facets in their work and so forth like that. Okay? So, first of all, about me. I do web, iOS, and Mac development. I am a software architect. I've done software architecture for close to 20 years now on various kinds of projects and so forth like this. I'm a healthcare systems and data exchange consultant. I'm actually deeply involved with international healthcare standards. And so one of the things I'm going to show you, some of the things that I've done are things that evolve around using Ruby in working with some of these things, with the standards themselves and so forth like that. But that's way back at the end. I'll show you some of the code and stuff like that that I've worked on and done for things. Now the first thing, the hump that we hit, and that's not so much for this crowd, and I put this in because you know, as we've been with various meetups, we get varying degrees of experience with people coming to the meetups. And some people are very, very new to both programming, to Ruby, and all sorts of stuff. The really old farts like me were used to doing things on the command line because that's how you did things, okay? But younger people, you show them a command line and they get, you know, they think that we're all beanie heads, okay? And so I just want to say that Ruby on the command line is one way to get away from that, right? That's not where we're gonna, you know, you don't have to be the geekiest person. You can show off your skills and people will be impressed and, ooh, look what I do. I tape it in and I look like the hacker in the movies now. And stuff scrolls on your screen and everything's wonderful, right? You know, but you know, this is not going to be deeply, you know, propeller head kinds of stuff, right? We're not going to get into some, you know, those sorts of things. Now, it is going to be Unix oriented because I'm Unix oriented, and that means Windows command line. I have used Ruby on the command line in Windows before. And it does work, but I haven't used it in a long time because I don't work on Windows command line. Now, Windows Subsystem for Linux gives you some possibilities here, so yay for this, right? When you're running on Windows devices, this might be something that you want to consider if you're looking at using Ruby in terms of automations and things on the command line, okay? Just so that we're aware. I don't like to cut off sections of the audience. I know that a large section of people are using either Macs or Linux machines on their laptops. But I do see Windows machines, and I'm always conscious to say, you know, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with the architecture or anything like that. It's just not something that I use because I use Unix from a long time ago. So for me, my 3 pillars of command line happiness really fall into 3 different areas of things where I'm doing stuff. Either I'm writing really simple scripts, maybe I'm looking at Rake, and depending on what I'm doing and so forth, or then I'm dropping into Thor as well, okay? And Thor is a gem/framework that you can use for doing command line work in Ruby. So I'm going to cover all these 3. This is not exhaustive when we're talking command line Ruby. You can talk tons of other things. They have specific applications. You can talk Capistrano, right? Which is essentially command line Ruby layered on top of some other things for doing server deployments and stuff like that. You could talk Puppet and Chef, which are, you know, tools that sysadmins are using for doing system provisioning, and stuff like this. They're all written in Ruby. And there's a reason for this, is because Ruby is good and cool, and it does these things well, and you build DSLs and so forth. So I'm going to start off with simple scripts. Now, when it comes down to it, like what I do is I open up my editor, and I start typing something in. Normally, I'm going to name my file something.rb, just so that whenever I see it in the editor, I know it's a Ruby file, and it'll format correctly and stuff like that. The first line there identifies when you actually execute the text file in a Unix system. I'm going to give you a little bit of Unix history here. That first line identifies the processor that should be used in doing the system. So if you change the file to be executable, and then you simply type it in on the command line in a Unix system, which includes Macintoshes, the shell processor actually peeks inside the first line and says, oh, what is this? Because it's not an a.out format. It first checks to see if it's a.out or text. If it's text, it looks at the first line. If it sees that, which used to be called a shebang, and I'm not sure if that's misogynist, so I wasn't going to say it if it was a mixed audience. But the Thatch bang, or octothorpe exclamation point, however you want to call them. It's properly called an octothorpe, by the way. That tells it, go and find the environment Ruby, and then use that to use this script. That's how you do bash scripting. That's how you do any kind of scripting. So if you're doing Python, there's one for Python. There's all sorts of things like this. And that just invokes the interactive processor, and it processes the rest of it. Okay, this little thing here uses the Ruby standard dir and does the glob. And what that does is it's wherever I'm executing from, it just searches all the subdirectories and finds me all the JPEG pings and GIF files. GIF, don't hit me. Okay? Gives me a list of them. I sort it. This changed 2 versions of Ruby ago and caused a whole bunch of command line things to stop working because they were expected them all to be in alphabetical order, and then they suddenly weren't, and stuff would be, right? With my Ruby motion work, right, it used to process the files in order, and then, it stopped, right, because of the dir.glob thing, and they couldn't figure out why things weren't compiling anymore and stuff like that. So, but anyway, so add the sort, just to be sure. You should always add a sort if you want it sorted, right? And then each, and I go through and I do something interesting. Now, I could use this to, for instance, take a whole tree of GIFs and produce thumbnails, or do something like that, right? Depending on how difficult it is to do the operation, I mean, the actual script to do it is, it's a 20-second script, right? So these are the sorts of things that when you're just on simple scripts that, you can do quite easily. Another thing that I could do is I'll include active record, right? Now I establish my connection. I'm using it on a Mac where it's done locally, so I don't have to provide a username and password because I'm the database owner and my user and stuff like that. I put in a function there because I want to zip out the table name. Then I do a dir glob on my load files directory of all my CSV files. Now what I've done, or what I actually use for myself, is I have a little mechanism where a CSV load into a table is done simply on a table-by-table basis. So I include the actual table name in the file, but I prefix it with a series of digits, digit dash, digit dash. Okay? My parse table name slices that out. So I take the file name, which will be something like 00-01, which is probably the first one, right? And then, codes. And then it knows, and it takes that, and then it goes the dir.glob, sorted, of course, because, which is the number for the numbering thing, goes through each of them, and then executes the copy command. If you have a series of CSV files and you're using like a DB seed in Rails, try using this and see how much it increases in speed. That copy command? Sorry? Oh, yes, certainly, certainly.
Just started the talk Ruby meetup here.
Grab a seat, make yourself comfy.
Do you ever name any of those files emojis?
No. This is not complete, in case you're looking at it. One of the things that you have to do after you copy the menu is you have to set the max so that your next key, right? So you have to do a query on the table. And I'll actually show you my Rake script that I use for doing this, because I have Rake that actually does an export, and then we'll look at differences, and then we'll import all the files. And so it'll maintain, skipping over the ones that I don't want to do, so that I can actually do CSV import exports from a database, which means that I'm now database independent, right? Because CSVs can be imported normally into any database, right? See, if I do a PG dump, I can only import that into PGs, or I'm spending hours trying to convert it into MySQL syntax. If I dump a bunch of CSV files, I just have to reload them in the same way once I get them to the new database, right? So that's just you know, and as you can see, it's not a lot. The one thing that I did have to do is I had to define my method before I used it. And that's because it's executing it from top to bottom, and it knows nothing, right? So you have to define the method so that it knows that the method is there before it gets to it, because it's simply going through and it hits the define and goes, oh, okay, I'll create a method and I'll store it. Actually creates a method, I believe it's on kernel, because you're running within kernel within the main Ruby processor. So any methods you create are actually a method that's now being added to kernel. I believe that's so. You're looking at me a little bit funny.
Oh, I always look at you a little
Okay.
bit. The thing maybe you lose out doing CSV is like if you have like indexes or like that kind of stuff. I guess it would all just make it.
Well, so that's the reason why I do the complicated numbering scheme, is because I add them in order, and so that you don't have, right? So what you're adding is top level tables before, you know, and you'll have one top level and another top level before the join table, right?
Import your comments before your authors.
Bingo, bingo, right? Right, and that's why I do the numbering scheme with it, right? So when you're doing the export, you know, you have to have these set up and stuff like that, and so forth. So you have to know the order, you have to know the database well enough to do that, right? This was more for demonstration, but I mean, you can do things like this with database just in a simple script, right? You know, you include active record and off you go, right? You can do queries. If you pull in your models, you can actually do things against the models as well, using the active record syntax, right, just within a command line script. I've actually used it for doing dumps where I do conversions. So I had to do one once where I was pulling a list of people, and then I was running double metaphones on the names so that we could do like matching, okay? And so I had to generate from the data that was coming in the double metaphone column, right? So you start working with CSV, and then, right, so you read from the database, and then you're writing your own CSV file out, which you then use as an import after you've changed the table, right? So once again, that was simple scripts. Let's take a look at Rake. So Rake is Ruby plus make. And make is the Unix utility for building C programs. It was C, I mean, it's been extended, but it was there when they built Unix. They needed a way to build these complex programs, right, which had multiple source files, so they built make. And as a ex-user of make, I can tell you that make is ugly and powerful. Like many things on Unix, they're ugly and powerful, okay? So what happened is in the early days of Ruby, a guy named Jim Weirich, come on in. A guy named Jim Weirich who actually had far more inappropriate facial hair than I have, built this utility called Rake. And you actually, if you've done Rails, you've seen it. I mean, they've converted now so that you do, Rails DB and stuff like that. But it's actually just doing a call to Rake. Jim actually died in 2014. This is one of the primary contributions. He also built the Builder library. He was a wonderful member of the community. Unfortunately, I never had a chance to meet him, but everyone really raved about him. So anyways, Rake comes from that. And it's useful. So, I have a bunch of things, right? I need to do this. I need to do this. This is dependent on this. This is dependent on these previous things. These two things have to happen before this happens. This is where Rake excels, okay? There's a long line of utilities for doing things like this, which Make sits in the way back distant future and so forth. If you've ever built Ruby from scratch, you'll know that the initial step is to run this .configure. I'm not sure if anyone's built Ruby from scratch, right? It does the .configure. That was the Unix way of generating a make file that would work for your system, because the Unix systems were so different. So there was a pre-make that would build your make, and then you do a make. Okay? And then you do the make build and make install and stuff like that, right? Okay? So what it is make was a way of defining all the interdependencies of how these things would all work. And Rake is doing this too. So when you have things where you have chains of events that need to occur, chains of processes that need to occur, Rake is the tool to use. Okay? Now we see it in Rails with the DB stuff, but there's lots of other ways that you can use this as well. So the first thing that it's often very good for is generating things like documents. Okay? And I'm not necessarily talking your standard Word documents, although I actually have done word generation from Rake. Can be done. Okay? But if you're doing PDFs and so forth like this, you're looking at tools that you're combining into pipelines to build things where you have assets that may change, may be variable and stuff like this. This is one of the areas where it's a really good tool. People have also used it for websites. And one of the links that I'm including at the end with reference links actually talks about, I think Martin Fowler wrote up, he's got a good example of using Rake, and he talks about using it to build a website for him. If you're looking at static web generation, what you may do in a Rails project is you may have static pieces which need to be pulled from a series of resources and things like this, and so forth like that, that put together that you then load into your static piece, and then it just sits there. So it's primarily static. It's static when it goes to the server, but there might be changes that occur, and you want to log these changes. That's a good place to start putting Rake things. In the Rails community, a lot of people have put Rake things just for these background jobs and stuff like that. And there's a lot more to it than that. Also, which kind of includes the previous two, but processes where you have multiple interdependent steps. Anything where you have that, where you have chains of things, chains of operations, where, I need to do this, I need to assemble all my JPEGs and put them here, I need to size them like this, I need to do that, I need to process my XML files, I need to convert these JSON files into XML, all that sort of stuff, right? That's where Rake, works really well. So normally when you're running Rake, you open a Rake file. And at the top, you'll require whatever extra things that you need to do. And when you're processing it, when you type the command Rake, it just looks in the same directory and finds your Rake file and starts running it. Now, what I put in this one is a bunch of stuff. It's not nearly cohesive, so you'll excuse me, but it's a bunch of things that you probably haven't seen in Rake files before, which are things that you can do. Okay? Now the first thing is you can build lists of things, and then you can change things about those lists. So if I have a series of uploaded files that are all JSON files, and I need to make them into YAML files, because I'm going to show you a YAML JSON converter later. if I need to make them into YAML files, right? What I can do is, say where it's upload star.xml, upload star.json, right? And I can path map it to source, and I can actually change that small x at the back. I can change that to being, YAML instead. And then what I do at the bottom is I can define rules, which says when I have a file that I want to exist, something.yaml, source.whatever, because it's just uploaded, .yaml, and I have a source file, source.something.json, here's the steps that I go about doing it. Right here I'm showing using a shell command to convert .fo. FO is formatted objects, which is an XML format. And there is a processor for FO called FOP, for FO processor, naming, which will produce PDF. Actually, that's how I do most of my PDF production. If you want to do a fancy PDF, take a look at FOP, okay? You can actually use CSS in FOP, okay? But it's XML, so, we might be going back to the propeller head a little bit. But at any rate, right? So that's a rule. So I can just say, if I have, here I'm saying I have final catalog.pdf, it'll go searching through and it'll say, okay, if I have a PDF, I must have an FO file somewhere. And if it doesn't find it, it'll say, okay, well, how would I get that? Is there something that builds that FO file? And I can build these, like, so my FO files could be dependent on, series of XML files or other things like that, right? And I could specify explicitly or not all the pieces that it was dependent on. This syntax here, task all, is dependent on this and this. Task support is dependent on this. Now, one of the things you can do within a task is you can call another task, right? And then within tasks, you can, of course, do things like cleaning up your disk, right? So a standard one is the cleanup. I put these within a namespace, so you know that when you do rake db, db is a namespace, right? So my standard CSV processing for dumping and extracting, I do db CSV. So I create a namespace within db called CSV. I'll show you that in a little bit later, right? Here I've got the catalog.fo is dependent on support files, which I built up here, right? And then I can have a bunch of Ruby functions that produce them and munge them together and produce something. Maybe I'm doing something with Builder. Here's where Builder comes in handy if I want to generate FO, right? So that's done in a rake file. I can chunk things out of this and put them into subfiles and pull them in. There's syntax for doing that. This is not the complete syntax for rake. There are tons of things that you can do with rake. I've left that into the examples so that, I will show you some of my less complex rake files. One of the ones that I did the production, what we did was we allowed business analysts to make changes for localization of specifications using Excel. We then dumped those out as CSV. I took the CSVs to produce differential documents from the core spec, as well as the updated spec documents in both Word and Excel, doing a rake process with lots of XSLT transforms. Lots of XSLT transforms. Running, and then FOP and stuff like this and so forth. So the things that you can do, and this is that major pipeline thing, right? I've also built things for doing production of standards from core sources and stuff like that, doing it. So, last one we're going to talk about is Thor. So, Thor was created to build complex command line utilities. Thor is actually what runs your Rails commands. When you go Rails gen, that's Thor. It's all Thor underneath, okay? So if you've ever built a generator, what you'll be doing with is you're using Thor syntax, which has a whole bunch of Rails stuff layered on top, and then to do your own things, right? So that's made possible by Thor. Thor at its simplest is very simple. It's actually a lot simpler than building a generator. Generators, there's a bunch of things that you need to fit into, and you need to understand the structure. So, but Thor is actually very simple to use and makes it relatively easy, which is why I believe that they used it. Okay. It uses the git kind of command syntax. So I mean, if you're all familiar with git on the command line, it's git add, git remove. It's, git first and then your subcommand. So that major command, subcommand, that's kind of the way that Thor works. Okay. So you have Thor running, and there's a couple of ways of running Thor, either within a Thor syntax, much like Rake, or building something that runs independently. And you then have access to that sort of a git approach to doing your commands. Okay? It's got a simple DSL for building options on. So whenever you're looking at command line processing, often you're seeing these dash, RSpec or dash, DB equals PostgreSQL. All those sorts of things. That's standard Unixese that has developed over the years, the dashes or the dash, what it means when it's, right? So Thor has a syntax for doing that, and it's very simple and straightforward for adding these things so that you can build things that work like proper Unix command line things very simply. And I will get to showing you eventually a very simple Thor script, which will give you all of that and then put it all up for you, right? And the command help is actually generated from the DSL. So it makes it really simple to use to put something up. And then when you're on the command line, you go, what does this thing do? What are the options? You can just do help, and then it's all there for you. Okay? So where I normally start out is I'll open in a directory myutil.thor. We call them .thor files. Many of the editors will know that .thor is a Ruby file, so you're good. Okay? I'm requiring YAML here. I'm requiring JSON. This is, I'm going to take a YAML file and I'm going to spit out JSON, right? This is all the code that you need. By the way, this is fully functional. Take it, use it. It's good. Right? So what I do is I build a class, and I descend that class from Thor, right? So my direct answer is Thor itself. And that gives me a bunch of, DSL goodness right in the thing. So there's this desk command, there's this method option, and then there. One of the comments I want to make is if I have things that I don't want to expose, this is actually exposed as a, shall we call it a Thor function? That's the subcommand that you'll see, right? This I didn't want exposed, right? Now, I mean, it's small enough, why didn't I put it in there? I just did it to illustrate that anything that's private does not show up, right? This is handy when you're doing help and stuff like that because you don't want necessarily everything in there. What I want is, here's my commands, here's what I can do. That's okay. Here's my commands, here's what I can do. And then I've got all these other functions, right? So as I build larger and larger Thor scripts, it's going to pollute the space for doing helps and stuff like that. Okay? Now, what normally happens is this file is sitting in my directory, and I run it within the Thor processor, much like we're doing with Rake, right? So you do Rake, and it just looks for the Rake file. Thor looks for any .thor files in the directory, and then it processes them. I'm going to add something to this to make it so that I can actually make it executable and stick it somewhere, and it'll just run on its own. But if I do that in a directory of Thor files, it won't actually run. The Thor will find that one that has the run, and so then it mucks up if I have more than one Thor file, right? So if I want to make this executable, all I need to do is that. Now, I need to have the processor line at the top to tell it it's a Ruby file. And of course, I'll have to make the file, I'll have to do a chmod on the file. Propeller head a little bit here. Chmod is changing the permissions so that the system knows that it's executable. right? So you do a chmod plus x, and then you give it the file name, right? So, but really, then it has that, and then, you know, I take that file and I stick it somewhere, and if it's in my path, I can just type, you know, the file name, and it will run it as like any other kind of a script, and I will get all of the Thor goodness that comes from that, with method options, with the parameters, with help, everything, right? I'm going to show you some stuff on the command line in the live bit that'll give you sort of a sense of what you're seeing with some of these things.
To run that command line, you need the whole Thor environment installed on the machine, right? With Ruby and all that. Like, you couldn't just move it to another generic Linux server. You would need to have Ruby and Thor.
So you will need to have Ruby and Thor.
Yeah,
Yeah, right. So it's not compiling it to an executable, right? You know, just to be sure, right? The disadvantage of an interpreted language is you need the interpreter, and when you're building on, right, you know, if probably you should do a require Thor in there as well if you're going to do that, just to make sure you have the Thor installed, right? So otherwise it'll blurb out, you know. But if you have those things, then yeah, right? So most people aren't aware that because they have Rails installed, they've got Thor. You know, if you look at your bundle list, you'll see it in there. So you know, it's if you're just building things on your device or on your system, you know, this will work for you. Knowing that you need it is important. People go, "Oh, I ran your thing, Andy, and it didn't work." Well, did you have Thor installed? Well, no. Did you install Ruby? No. Well, so anyways, I'm going to switch over here. And I'm going to show you a few things. So first off, this is actually the Rake script I use with my consulting business accounts data. So I do all my backups and so forth by using this, right? So this uses the same syntax that I was showing you in the simple script, but fleshed out, right? So for instance, to update the sequence, this is what you need. Now, one of the other things that I've done here that you didn't see in the simple scripts is I have a lot of puts statements. Puts is your friend, especially on the command line. A command line process that's going to take 30 seconds to run, where you enter, you know, where you're just sitting there and suddenly it goes done. Okay, what did it do? Why did it take that long? So having status dumping out is always a good thing. I mean, our spec, they came up with, well, this might take long, so at least let's put dots up there, right? Same sort of idea, right? Is you want to dump some feedback to the user that things are happening. You can get fancy with that. There's progress bars. I haven't tried using any of those on the command line, to be honest. I have been tempted at times, but normally I find that I want the record of things dumping. I did this, I did this, I did this. I'm going to run one of my Thor scripts that actually does a fair amount of work, and you'll see the level of normal debugging. One of the things about about Thor that I like is, of course, I include a standard option for increasing the debug level. So I can turn it up or down as I need on the option without having to go in and edit the code, right? So this does, you know, this shows you, like, for instance, load is dependent on environment. That actually comes from the normal Rails rake. What you want to do is have your things dependent on the environment, and it sets up the environment properly. Because this is standalone, I actually define environment on my own. And what that does, let me scroll down. There we go. Right? I created the little class there, temp, just so that I could use it if I needed to. Sometimes it's easier to do temp.something than you the full active record base dot connection dot execute sort of idea, right? See, there's the load table that does it. It does a file exists first just to make sure that the CSV file that I'm trying to load is actually there, right? You know, there's the parse table name, which is identical to the one that I had in the script. One of the things that I do up here is this actually does an extract using similar syntax from the database, knowing to skip certain files. It's in there somewhere. I have a list of certain tables, because there's some tables that you don't want the information from, that you don't want when you're pulling out. Active record actually creates one to track your migrations. So you don't want that table, right? Okay, so when you're doing it. So, you know, it dumps them out into an extract one, and then it actually does a system diff. And if they're different, it'll actually copy the new one over the old one. And then because the extract one, I just wipe out when I'm done. But I update my new one, and then I can run git to commit, because I just store all this in a git. And this is how I actually maintain my backups. And the extended puts that you'll see on some of these things are because then I dump this all into a script on my Mac that runs at a regular basis, like once a night. And so I've automated, you know, the capturing of all that data, and it just runs for me and updates my repository. And then, you know, I didn't go so far as to actually do the check-in in the script. You know, I left that. I just wanted to make sure. But, you know, so I mean, this has now become a standard thing that I actually use on most of my projects where I'm running with the database. So I literally find it easier because of this and because of reference data that I'm using, particularly if I'm working with medical systems. Sometimes you have to load code tables that are large, right? But the table is relatively static. So you've got predefined load files that you want to run all the time, and you need to get those set up. And it's just kind of a hassle. So, but for me to generate the files that work in the load and then load them up and then get everything going, it's a relatively straightforward process. I sometimes just run through my entire, like I wipe out my database, create it, run my migrations, run by load, I'm up and going. And it's, because I'm using the copy froms, it takes, actually for my accounting database, which only has tens of thousands of records, the entire creation from scratch is about a 45-second process.
So this is creating like your development environment database?
My production too.
Oh.
Yeah.
You store your production data in Git?
I'm storing some of my things in that I need for doing some stuff, right? So I've yeah. Not every production database. What I'm saying is that this is, you know, you have those files, you can move those files wherever you want, right? So that you have access to them. Put them on a secure place in AWS. Where do you store all your secure production data? Depends on what you're doing and what kind of data it is, right? Yeah. Right?
Do you ever run into, like none of this is around, there's no transactions or anything? Have you ever run into like half your table exports and then something blows up and you're not even transacting?
No, I haven't. Now you could wrap them in transactions, right? You know, you can extend it for what you're doing. You run this on a different process. You run it against a mirror database. There's a number of ways that you can do this, right? When you're looking at, and this is just an example. I mean, this is a simple thing. I do this a lot with development stuff because I can run them up quickly, or I can spin up databases and things. I do it with small projects where I'm working on things. I mean, like if I'm looking with a large, you know, if I'm talking millions of rows, I'm not doing this. I've got backups, right? You know, I hope I've got backups. If I've got millions of rows, you know, depending on what I'm doing, you know, do I have a DBA that I have access to? Do I have somebody that's responsible for the database? Do I have, right, you know, we need processes, right? I mean, they should be talked about if not written down. What I am saying, however, though, is that there are things that you can do. where a lot of this stuff came from is originally when I was working with Java development teams in the mid-2000s. We had, they had to spin up versions of the database for the stuff that they were working on. It was for Alberta Health, where they each had a version of their own data, right? So we needed a consistent data set so that they could run, that would also run on the CI machine. And so I was doing a whole lot of stuff with, you know, having to generate or reload the database so that you had a consistent starting spot for when you could run, you know, your database pieces from, right? So that you had reference data in there and stuff like that. You weren't starting with like no users, no anything, no stuff like, you know, so you, and you had to have all your code tables. Code tables are complex in healthcare. Let me just leave it at that, right?
Like your medical code tables, right? Like
Yeah.
broken arm code.
Loink, SNOMED. Do you know what I'm talking about? Loink, SNOMED? No. SNOMED is a network code system that allows for post-processing of codes and has over 200,000 terms in it. Okay, post-processing is where, see, all the codes that you're probably used to, see, like think of country codes. Okay, that's the list, right? That's the list. If you need to add a new country, you add a new entry. Post-processing is, no, I take codes and I mush them together at runtime, and I make new codes. Surgery of the lower abdomen, or an appendectomy, either one. Welcome to healthcare.
It's more like a language at that point.
You betcha. Oh yeah. And there's still 200,000 terms in it. Oh yeah. And they're interrelated, right? Because when I need to do abdominal surgeries, I need to find the appendectomies as well as the surgery lower abdomens, right? So I'm not just looking for a qualifier, I'm looking for the network. That's why it's a network code system. So, at any rate, so we were dealing with having these conditions where you had to load databases and stuff like this, right? And I was trying to do this in Ant scripts. And we were having devils of a time. There were utilities out there for preloading your data and so forth like that, and they were wonky, and you know, we were having difficulty with running our test suites and so forth. And so being able to work on this more and more, and it's just evolved over time, right? So this is just an example of doing something, you know, in Rake, where you have the dependencies, right? You know, so I can execute a table clear, which does something, or I can do a table reload, which is dependent first on a table clear and then loading all my data if I needed to do, and general utilities like that, right? So, which can be very handy for your developers so that they can wipe their database and then just restart it. You know, in a spot that's relatively clean, right? They know what they're getting, so if they're hitting against it, right? Because they're adding things in by hand, or they're, well, what if I put this in the database? What do I get back in my code, and so forth like that. So that was just meant as an example there. Now here, this was that convert YAML to JSON that I was talking about, and here I've done it in a simple one. I had commented out the method option because I was just generating the output file name by doing some parsing. I removed that from the other one because I want to show you the method option. This is very simple. What I've done here, told you I was walking, is I have this directory with a whole bunch of my utility functions. And I go here when I need to do something, right? I'm going to create some utility for doing something. I know where to go and find it, right? So this is all stored. I have source data and output data and generated stuff that I need to do. And I've created a whole SWAC. Not all of these are used. This is my actual, you know, Git working directory of different Thor files for doing different things, right? And this was just one of them because I had some YAML files and I needed to generate JSON so that I could use them in an iOS project because it was, I was having difficulty in importing the YAML package, and just making them into JSON made it, you know, how long is this going to take me? Oh, is that it? Okay, fine. There, I'm done. It was actually some YAML files with terminology in it for classification of healthcare messages. So then I just, put this together and I generated that and, I had it, right? So this is what the directory looks like. I'm going to show you some of the other files in here, but this is, the real working version of that one. I just left it in here because, if I need to convert something, I pull it over and I can refer to it locally and it'll just do it locally, or it'll refer to it off in some other directory. I just come over here. These aren't things that I need polluting my command space. There are things that I run when I need to run them, and I just go into the directory. That's why it's set up like that. It's just meant to be run from here. And a bunch of these are sort of like that. And one of them is not, which is the Xcode generate, which I'll show you as well, okay? So what happens is if I go over to my terminal, now hopefully this is, okay, that was weird. Come on back here. This will be big enough for, is it fairly legible?
Yep.
Make it one bigger. There we go. Okay, so I'm in that directory. I do something called Thor list, and it actually goes through and finds all the Thor files, and those descriptions that occur before each method, it actually lists them out, right? So it puts it together like that, and then gives me the full description of it. And can I see it in here? I probably have to scroll up. Generate color set, convert, there it is. Put it up at the top of the screen. I got the wrong comment on it, right? But it does that. Now, you can actually get further help for the methods and stuff like that by running it and doing a dash help on it, right? So if I want to do anything, right, essentially what it does, it takes the class name snake cased, lower snake cased, and then with the colon, and then appends the method, right? So running within Thor, right? So I just type Thor, whatever it is, and then I've just got the simple file and I can run it, okay? I'm going to show you one of my complex scripts, and I'm going to show you that executing, and it'll execute for a few minutes, and I can talk over it while we're doing it. And so this is, just the way of doing it, right? So the complex one that I was going to show, so this file, now it's messy, right? It's meant for me, so, excuse. It has a number of things in it. So what I've created here was I needed to build the underlying type structure for processing fire messages using Swift. So I'm generating all my Swift resource data files from the live specification that's on the web, because they update it on a regular basis. Now I can actually go to the R4 as a release of the specification. I actually have an R4 and an R3, so I can do that. This is actually utilizing the profile classes that I built for doing some other things. It's actually a Rails generator, which will generate database definitions and so forth. And so I'm reusing that profile thing to do it. This is large because there's a lot of output. I'm dumping out Swift files, Now this is probably something that you haven't thought of, which is using Ruby as a code generator for other languages. Because of Ruby's string processing, Ruby is a snap. The other thing is the speed that you're looking for is okay. The real time is spent writing the program, right? You know, Ruby versus Python, they're both very similar in many things. Python is a lot faster than Ruby, you know, nearly invariably for anything that you're going to look at, okay? But if the difference is between 3 seconds and 3.5 seconds, then who cares? Especially when you're looking at a command line, right? So this is one where, you know, by doing it, right? Now, like I said, some of these are dense. You know, people might suggest, if I ran Rubocop on this, that my first function here, I think, probably has, you know, 60-odd lines or whatnot. But so that I understand what I'm writing out, notice that I don't necessarily pack my output statements to make them concise, because I want to see that, oh, I'm writing out, you know, the comments at the header, you know, line by line by line, right? So, you know, before you jump all over the code and say, oh man, that was ugly, Andy, that was the ugliest code I have ever seen. Just, just so we're going through it, right? So, I mean, there's quite a bit, because it will do individual things and so forth. And it does actually generate quite a bit. And then I have a whole series of private methods which do the work. So I did try to clean it up a little bit. So there's about 700 lines in this Thor file. You could break it up. You know, there's nothing wrong with breaking it up. You could, you know, remodularize things like this. One of the things when I'm doing something like this is, because I'm doing it bit by bit, I'm adding it as I'm going, you know, or I'm going in and making a change when something won't compile in Swift when I come back with it, is I found it easier to leave it all in one. There's a lot to be said for breaking something into smaller pieces, particularly if you have multiple teams, right? You know, a 700-line file is harder for a team to maintain than 3, you know, 250-line files. Just, that's, you know, that's a rule. But being as it is, it's generally a one-person maintenance job, and it's a very special purpose. You know, this is what it is, right? So, let me see. Thor, generate Swift. I'm going to do the fire data types. Help. GH. No, it's not. That's not giving it to me. Okay. Let me see if I remember it off the top of my head. I want I'm going to do current. There we go. R current. Yeah, I'll just do it like that. There we go. So each of these is a call out to a JSON object that it's retrieving. It's skipping over a bunch of them. It's then doing some dumping out of some of the stuff because it's retrieving code sets. And then it's writing all my resources. So that produced approximately 75 Swift files containing somewhere over 8,000 lines of code.
I don't know much about Swift, but like, if this is just generated from an online resource publicly available, like, why do you have to make all these files at all? Should this be built into the Xcode or?
No. This is the definition of the interface. So this is fire, right? This is a fire claim. So what I'm generating is actually the source files for these, so that I could then build one of these, which would then reference all of these data types. So there's a whole bunch of stuff. So actually, the fire standard eats its own dog food. So you can actually download the definitions for the API in Fire using Fire, because they have a resource type called resource definition or structure definition, which they code all the resources in, including all the data types. So I then go through and I have to parse the data type, which is just in JSON. And one of the things in Swift that I'm doing to make use of Swift features is they have, enums are used quite a bit in Swift. And so so the other thing too is your JSON objects have to be defined. So when I'm hitting a JSON interface in Swift, Swift is a strongly typed. We want to talk about strongly typed versus loosely typed, okay? What happens is if you send me something in the JSON object that isn't defined in my JSON object, Swift goes, bleh, this is garbage. Right? So there has to be that careful mapping between them, okay? Whereas in Ruby, we just convert it into a hash, and if it's not there, it's not there, right? These are the differences between strongly and loosely typed languages, right? You know, so one of the advantages, right? So to come up with something that actually works with some of this stuff, and there's logic that goes into it as well, right? So there's some infinite recursions, and when you're using structs in Swift, you can't have infinite recursion because they're value types, right? So you can't properly do a complete part of, as we'd formally do, in Swift using structs. You can with classes because they're not value types, but language stuff, right? So this is available as a JSON file. It's also available as XML, but JSON is just easier to process on the web, right? And so if you're interested in looking, build.fire.org. Claim is actually one of the resources that I've been responsible for creating. So, if you're ever interested in healthcare claims. No, I'll go back here. Right, so that was running it on the command line. Now, the other one that I had that I wanted to show you was this one. So, one of the things that happens within Xcode is when you're building an Xcode project, you need to supply all your assets that you see, all the images and so forth like that. They have to be in the proper sizes. So your icon has a whole set of prescribed sizes for your assets, right? So there's all these, like if you go into Photoshop, you can buy a plugin for Photoshop or Illustrator, I'm not sure which one, maybe Illustrator, that will generate your proper asset sizes. Or you could write a Thor script, okay? Because all the tools are available for you. Now, I'm not going to run this here and then move my stuff over. The thing that I'm doing with this one is this Thor script, I want to appear as a utility, right? So I want to be able to, within my Xcode project, execute Xcode generate where is it? App icon, right? And I'll point it at my source file because I've done some graphic work, or I've stolen a picture that's available free, or something, which I may show you, right? I'll just use a free picture or something like that. I mean, I had some pictures of some things that I downloaded. And then I wanted to actually populate my asset catalog correctly, right? And there was a whole bunch of things that you needed to do. I need to generate XML. XML, well, Ruby has Builder. It's great at that, right? Rescale all the images and place them all in the appropriate directories, right? And so, but then what I wanted to do with this one is, I need to put it somewhere. So I created actually a folder on my Dropbox which contains all my executables, and I just added that to my path. That way on any of my systems, they all have the Dropbox, they all have that folder, it's all on my path because I'm using the same, I can't remember what the profile is called now with Z Shell. As you noticed, I converted to Z Shell. On the new Macs, they're using ZSH. And then I went full out bore, so I don't know if you saw that either. It's kind of cool, actually. The stuff at the bottom shows me my load, shows me actually free memory, shows me my Git branch, it'll show me dirty files, right? This is OMyZ shell, OMyZSH, right? So that's an add-on to Z shell. So, you can configure it with all these sorts of things. So I spent some time playing with that, and it's really handy, right? So it gives me my list, but it contracts all the ones, the previous, so the higher level. So I know where I am in the tree, but it doesn't give me the full thing. It took a little bit of getting used to because so many things, I mean, I've used Bash since 97. Before that, I used Corn Shell. So Bash is very similar to Corn Shell for most of the things. Bash is a little bit better with completion. But Z Shell is, the completion is even like way better, like turn it up to 11, right? So anyways, highly recommend it for anyone that's looking at it. If you're on a Mac and you upgrade to Catalina, it's not an option. Sort of, at some point it says, we're going to convert you. So I bit the bullet and did the conversion. But anyway, so I need to add it to my path. Now, if you remember what I told you before, you'll notice at the top I have the bin execute, but I don't have the thing at the bottom which says, run this. Because when I put it into this file, this whole directory, it stopped reporting all my Thor scripts. It just ran the one and said, I don't know what command you're trying to, and I'm going, oh, wait. So I built an install Thor script. And what that does, because like I said, Thor is used by the generators. The generators do all these things with adding in code and stuff like that. Where do you think they get that from? That's from Thor. So this piece takes whatever I list, right? So I just give a list of file names, right? I stick it in an array like that because then if I need to add ones to it later, it's just easy enough and everything's good, right? And I dump out what I'm doing, right? More puts, right? And then I take the file, I strip off the .thor because I want to type xcode generate. I don't want to type xcode generate.thor. I'm just anal that way, right? I move it to the dester, and then I determine what the executable name should be. I copy it over, I chmod it, and then I add the line that says, here's the class name, .start. Bada boom, bada bing, right? So I just run this install. So when I was doing my testing with Xcode, right, I just go into this directory and run my install anytime I made a change. And it's keeping me up to date because I'm just running the current one. Once again, once you start using these things, right, this becomes simple, and now I've got a process for where to do things for managing my own stuff, right? So where can I go here? I'm going to have to make that big. There we go. Let's see. So Swift. Yeah, I'm might build a new project here. Sure, I'll do that. Xcode may take a little bit of time to start. New project. You get to see Xcode and everything. Isn't that wonderful? Single view app. Junk. Swift, create. Okay, it's built the project. It's my assets, and you see it has no assets. So I am going to Xcode generate. Now this I'm sure works. There we go. Sorry. So I'm going to do the app icon, and I'm going to have to find a source file, which I think I have something. So let's code generate and do app icon. Now notice it's a little bit different, right? Where instead of the colon separating it here, I just this is where we get into the git command. That's because it's installed as an executable. And drop. Design, do I have anything in here? Sure, let's take this. Transparent background, it's a ping. Yeah, I think that'll work. Okay, good. There we go. If I go back to Xcode, there's my app icon, and it should be populated. Maybe it needs to update. Try it again. Might have had a problem with it. But anyways, that's, you know, so for doing things like that, for taking the, I'm not sure if this one will actually work, but it's supposed to generate all the app icons, and it produces the XML file, which then catalogs them all. And so you saw that I did create that. It almost looks like it didn't copy in the file. I will see about that.
Is SIPs just like a Unix?
It's an Apple thing for doing image manipulation, yeah.
I thought this was going to go to ImageMagick for sure.
No, no. So I don't have ImageMagick installed. I know most people do. It's because of the compile things and stuff like that, right? And so if I can do things, so SIPs is available on a Mac. So if I'm writing an Xcode utility, if you were, for me it's okay to include Ruby, but a lot of Xcode people don't like to have to go and install other things just to run things within their environment. So I do things with what's available on the base system.
I feel the same way whenever I install like no-code Geary and I have to pull down the entire Xcode and click accept, and then my native things work.
Well, that's because you're doing a local compile, right? You know, you're compiling C, so the quickest way to do that is to, yeah. So I mean, there's some of the actual practical uses that, I've done with this. Like I said, I had a bunch of things like for Rake for doing things. The what is Thor is probably the go there and then work from there and then look for other things. The Stuart Ellis article I found was actually particularly good. There's links from GitHub. The Martin Fowler article is about generating a website. It's old, but it's still a little bit fascinating. So, and that is it.